Be my victim.
Through watching scenes of violence, through watching scenes of transgression, through watching scenes of horror. There's an enormous amount of sort of abattoiral excess.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
We also try and be a little prompt sometimes. I had some practice last week. I tried to do an emergency stream on Screen 6 and do it in 1 hour. I managed that in a very snappy 90 minutes. It's all right. It was a warm-up. It was a warm-up. This actual speedrun edition will be done in an hour because the conditions sort of require it. We've had a bit of a schedule adjustment, so with huge apologies to the Wham in Hour crew. I'll be watching them on replay, and at the end of this tight hour, I'll be handing you over to TCG for the monthly community quiz. But before that, free of any topic, going straight into the meat of the matter, we'll be discussing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1994. I hope you managed to do your homework. It was not the easiest one to find for reasons that absolutely slipped by me, and I can make no sense of. That this film kind of hard to find. It's like people sort of forget about it or don't want to revisit it. I cannot think why. But we're going to puzzle over that tonight, and I'm joined by some wonderful guests. This is, of course, Christian Perspectives on Horror Month, and I absolutely had to have this chap on. Returning guest, Lambda, with a full face and a full name reveal. How you doing, Luke?
Yes, doing well. Very glad to be back. Looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent, excellent. Last time we had you on for Alien and Aliens. This, I hope, was this more to your liking?
No, I actually have very fond memories of doing Alien and Aliens. I did enjoy this film as well, though. Quite different. It shows the breadth of horror, I suppose, that all of these things, all of these flavors sit within it.
Yeah. And not just breadth of horror. Something I want to revisit another time is just how every generation tells a completely different Frankenstein story. And watching this, I had this on VHS as a young'un. It was one of my 30 VHSs that got watched a ridiculous number of times. And I was convinced this was the height of Frankenstein adaptations. And so I've got fond memories, but this is marinated in the 90s in a way that I never appreciated until now.
Probably one of those concepts, a bit like zombies, that sits in a certain place in a cultural discourse. I'm sure we'll get into it, but obviously the subject matter is ripe for letting the culture and letting the artists explore what it means to be human and what do we do with the things that we've created? What's the risk of pursuing, our hubris? And I'm looking forward to getting my teeth into this.
Oh, wonderful. Just before we do, you have a lot of things coming up. Do you want to quickly get a shell in? Because I want people to head over. Last year it was so much fun.
So I'm doing another week, a crazy week of streams on my channel, Lambda. I've actually renamed the channel and the event to Lambda Conversations. So if you search in Google, Lambda Conversations, and I'm doing 40 streams in 5 days.
How many?
So 8 hours a day is like a full-time job's worth. And of course, the peak one to tune in for is Proper Horror Show. I'll be joining me, and we'll be discussing. I think it's all the various approaches to film criticism is what we're going to do. Is that right?
That is indeed. I'm going to try and shoehorn it into a Bible study as well, and how there are comparable skills, and it might be the biggest reach of the festival, but I'm going to give it a go. Do you want to drop me a link in private chat, Luke, and I will then post it in the chat. And while you're doing that, I of course got to introduce my fantastic co-host, because who better to talk to? Oh no, where is it? Who better to talk to than you, the cause of my problems? My life is garbage. I'm about to take it out on you. It's that crime guy.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I don't know the name of that one. I've got a Twilight Zone and Bad Guy in my head because of the chat we had earlier.
That was Bad Guy.
Oh, it was? Oh, my God. There you go.
Yeah, that was from Bad Guy.
Oh.
I was going a bit more obscure because last time you just got it straight away after like one sentence. So.
Oh, God. And it's funny enough, I was actually listening to that after our conversation as well. I'm disgusted with myself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, chat. I've let you all down.
It's one of my favourites. Don't worry, I will still let you shill. So get a quick shill in while I post the link to Lambda's channel.
Yeah, sure. So I'm that crime guy, for those who don't know. I mostly cover true crime content over on my main channel. But on the odd occasion, I do a monthly quiz. Normally it's for the last Friday of the month, but as Horrorshow said, there's been a few scheduling shuffle arounds, and I too have been impacted by that. So I'm actually doing it immediately after this stream. So it'll be at around about 9 o'clock, and there'll be a link in the chat for you as well if you wanted to go and jump in there immediately afterwards.
Yeah, nifty. Okay, yeah, and we'll prompt at the end and head over there straight after this. But right, moving on to the subject. The focus of this is a Christian perspective on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, to set this in some kind of context, as I said, every generation both does Frankenstein and radically reinterprets Frankenstein. This, can I do this in 3 minutes? Let's try. That's a weird title, isn't it? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Why is it called that, coming out in 1994? Well, it is following the wild success of Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, which was produced by Francis Ford Coppola and went for a grand Gothic theme, operatic style. You will have noticed some of that operatic styling in this film. It was effectively trying to glomp onto that train, try and really push for the authenticity, and also try and stand out when there are so many versions of Frankenstein that basically, how do you even have the film stand out? Dracula had the exact same problem. There are so many dozens of Dracula films. You just have to go back to the basic Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is the authentic one. Now, in a bit of a contrast and a bold move, some would say, Kenneth Branagh decided to not really do that on the old authenticity track, which is a bit odd when you've called it Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to veer wildly from the story constantly. But, you know, chutzpah, you know, like, literally, if you turned up to see the Mary Shelley's version, I am very sorry to disappoint you. Like, things like, you know, this never happen for just like one of the wilder departures. This is nowhere in the original story. His friend Henry does not survive. I can't go into all the differences, but it is a wild departure. One of the reasons we might have that in this film is that Kenneth Branagh, from all we can tell, seems to have taken the helm of this. It was originally going to be more closely produced by Francis Ford Coppola, but Kenneth Branagh got the director's helm and a script by Frank Darabont, who produced The Mist, directed and wrote The Mist, that we discussed on one of our early films in this arc. And Frank Darabont, maybe because he's more successful now, felt confident to say, Kenneth Branagh went mental with this one, and he's basically disowned the film because Branagh took the script and went hog wild and veered wildly off course. This may inform some of the more interesting choices, such as why we have effectively a Mary Sue Victor in this one. Why Victor Frankenstein is bizarrely ripped. It's an odd choice. It's a very odd choice where the novel has Frankenstein as a man who is full of hubris and eventually learns to sort of rein it in after ruining his life. This one's kind of just good at everything and proven right all the time. Yeah.
Which does cut against the point of the story somewhat.
It really does. That the specialist boy is just too darn precious. Ooh. What were your initial thoughts on this film, Luke?
Well, I had a good time. I think it was a good romp. I thought it was very interesting. I mean, I should say I have not read the book, nor have I seen other adaptations. So I only know of Frankenstein. You know, I've obviously heard lots about the story, and so at this point, this is my only actual encounter with Frankenstein. And it is a very thought-provoking concept. I can see why it is returned to over and over again, and also interesting. I mean, I was thinking about how when it was originally made, presumably Mary Shelley was pushing back against the Enlightenment and like scientism, to kind of capturing a kind of romantic spirit.
This is why you're the perfect guest. Yes.
Versus Kenneth Branagh, who probably was more responding to fears about like GM, you know, genetic modification was around, I guess, at the time, and AI. I think we were already having some fears about AI. And so it's fascinating to have the conversation right now when every water cooler conversation is about exactly this topic of, are humans about to be replaced by something that we've created, and what are the implications of that?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. The questioning of rationalism and how could that go wrong is so into it. In fact, so I looked at my reference library. Clive Barker makes no mention of this film in his A to Z of Horror, which is a guilty pleasure of a research book. However, our friend E. Michael Jones in Monsters from the Id opens his book with an exploration of Frankenstein as precisely what you said, a reaction to the Enlightenment, a reaction to rationalism going too far, and fears about the loss of place in society. It's fascinating. We'll return and we'll do that whole chapter in another stream. Interesting question. White Hart. I think that could be on the way, but that is difficult. There's no reason you couldn't do a trans allegory Frankenstein, but there is actually a classic horror adaptation with a trans aspect to it coming up. And I've talked about this before, and it's about the worst one you could do. I want you guys to think for a second. What is the most insensitive choice you could go for? If you wanted to annoy absolutely everyone you wanted to pander to, what would you go for?
It's got to be Psycho in it.
Oh, no, we're talking more classic.
Oh, even more classic.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Eddie Izzard is starring in it. And yes, I would, if I wanted to champion the cause of trans rights, I would probably not lean with a story of someone who appears nice and genteel on the outside, but has a secret hidden violent male side, waiting to bust out and kill women. I'd probably go for any other story than that. If that was me.
Am I right to say there's a long history of trans characters ending up being serial killers in movies? I feel like I
Yeah,
saw a
there's a
video essay on
certain
this once.
reality informing that.
Okay.
Interestingly, though, The Silence of the Lambs goes out of its way to specifically tell you that Buffalo Bill, the serial killer in that film, is not trans, possibly to avoid protest. But
Okay.
yeah, that leads us into it. Well, yeah, as you say, this is Kenneth Branagh redirects it. The focus of this Frankenstein. One thing I couldn't get away from is this one isn't about hubris and a reaction. This one is about a deep psychological, psychoanalytical motivation, which feels so 90s to me that I would never have noticed this before. But now I just see like I have to look at the deep psychoanalytical motivation behind the character. He's actually making the monster, the creation, because he lost his mother. Doesn't happen in the books. And it's all about that.
Just got
And
Ed
I'm
Gein vibes.
sorry, TCG?
It's got Ed Gein vibes.
Yeah. It's such a 90s thing, yeah, the psychologizing. TCG, how about your thoughts on this? Had you seen this before? Were you familiar with it?
Yeah, when I was young, I'd seen this years ago. Like Luke, though, this is really my only deep venture into Frankenstein lore. I haven't read the book either. I've only seen sort of snippets from the classic, which is something that I'm sure we'll cover eventually on this channel. So yeah, I didn't really remember much. I mean, I was definitely prepubescent when I first saw this. I don't know, man. I think this is kind of I feel like this film's kind of Marmite. You either like it or you don't. And I remember watching it the first time and thinking, oh my gosh, it's scary, with my little kid brain. And then I watched it when I did the most recent watch, and I felt like the acting was a bit subpar in it. And that kind of threw me a little bit.
The accents do slip constantly.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing as well. In the last screenshot you showed, I'd expect Helena Bonham Carter to look like that now, just through age and cosmetic surgery. But it absolutely astounds me how that woman has not aged at all. It is incredible.
Oh yeah. She doesn't get much to do with it. It's got that weird ground of it's a 90s, so you have to bump up the women's roles. But they didn't really have much for her to do. Elizabeth is not a big figure at all. And it's hard to force that into it, to be honest. It's it's a shame, but it's got, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, I think it's the obvious comparison. It is kind of gorgeous, but also I found really unintentionally camp.
Yeah. Yeah. You say gorgeous, but I felt like some of the sets, like in particular at the Frankenstein house or mansion, I mean, you didn't really see much of that place, and one of the places that you do see is like a main hall, and it just looks barren, which is something that I wouldn't have expected to see from like an aristocrat style of family. It felt very bare. The scenes at the North Pole looked very much like sets, you know.
Yeah.
The ice in particular, towards the end of the film when it's all cracking up, you know, you can tell it doesn't look authentic. I think those sorts of things irked me.
Kenneth Branagh's style is quite theatrical, isn't it? It's like he's taking a play and putting it on the big screen.
I see.
That's how it feels to me, at least. That he is hamming it up a little bit, and that's just who he is, and I kind of love it. I would say his portrayal of Gilderoy Lockhart is possibly my favorite comedy role in any movie. I love it so much. So I'm all here for Kenneth Branagh's sort of slightly camp appeal.
Yeah, I mean, he threw himself into it. I think unintentionally. There's some comedy. For me, this feels like it was serious business for him, and
Yeah,
we referenced Gilderoy Lockhart when we were watching it. Sort of like, oh, that's just Ken. Bless
yeah,
his
I
heart.
agree. I don't think he was making a deliberate choice. That's just he can't get out of that mode of slight overacting, slight.
Mm,
But kind of joy. I mean, you said that the way it's shot is beautiful, and it is, and the
yes.
music as well. It's like delightful sensory experience to go through the film. And the same way with how he's toned his body. He's like he couldn't face delivering something that was truly like gritty real life. He wants you to he wants you to see him in a good light, even as a quote unquote tortured character.
He really does. Yeah, it's also, yeah, it's gorgeous sets. Something they use over and over again is the pale blue set or the pale set, and then the stark red costume. And it's quite obvious, but I'm going to be very honest with you. I loved it. I'm here for it. Is it subtle? No. It was gorgeous though, and I will lean into that. It's balanced out by a sort of very different De Niro, sort of grittier performance. But I mean, I'd go into it a fair bit more, but we do only have the hour, so we're going to skip over a lot of the stuff that we would normally cover. For instance, sad to say, there is where is it? I'm afraid there is no time for us to do the gay reading of this film, but there's probably nothing there to support that. And we'll go straight into the sort of deeper stuff. Where is it? Where's the thing I need for this? There we go, the religious reading. So Frankenstein from a Christian perspective. Is there a place you'd particularly like to start, Luke?
I think the obvious thing that springs to mind is the subject of what does it mean for something to be created, to be alive, to be in the image of man, playing God, right? This is I think the zone where the story is speaking in religious. It's kind of exploring religious territory. We see beginning of the Bible, the creation of man in God's image, and we see in, for example, Job, God basically saying, you puny little humans don't really understand what it means to be a creator. So then it's interesting that in the film, mankind tries to play God and then is sort of punished for it, for meddling with things that are beyond, it's kind of you could compare it to like the devil or Faust or whoever trying to be bigger than the role that humanity is created for, trying to grab hold of something that only God should have. And the warning of the film, therefore, being stay in your lane, stick to the domain that you were made for.
Yeah, it's I mean, it is obviously no accident that that the subtitle is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, aka Stealing Fire from the Gods. It did not work out well for Prometheus. It does not work out well for Victor. I'm reminded of, I thought of John 15, The Vine and the Branches, which I will often do because my Bible knowledge is weak, folks. I will fully, so when I casually mention John 15, it's because it's one of the few bits that I know well enough to go to. But that's I don't know if you'd say parable, but it's a parable of the vine and the branches. So from verse 5, it reads, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, You are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. AKA, if you're... AKA, oh, I can't speak tonight, folks, sorry. Meaning as I interpret it, if your mission is not connected to God, if it's not stemming from God, so this creative work is not stemming from God, it is not going to bear fruit, it is not going to be healthy, is not going to be successful. And that's what we see there. This is Victor sort of trying to do it himself, unconnected from anything. Is that wildly off course there, Luke?
No. Okay. So I was just pondering whether or not to bring in the very interesting further development of this idea of a vine and branches, which happens in towards the middle of the book of Romans. And it might just be a little bit off-piste for this stream, but yes, I'm debating, but I'll restrain myself. Yeah, the vine being Jesus being the source of life. It's a bit like if you see a branch lying on the ground, it will just die lying there, but you can graft it in to another, to the rest of the vine, and then it becomes life. And it's the idea, I think, is Jesus is saying, yeah, if you are in me, I'm the life that you need. If you go off piste and try doing stuff, by your own power, it is doomed inevitably to failure. Somebody brought up the Tower of Babel in chat. I thought that's a great reference as well, which was
good one, White Hart.
Right on, White Hart. The story there is that all these people were attempting to build this tower, trying to show their own self-sufficiency. Look how clever we are. Look what we can do. We're such smart humans. We can build a tower up to God. Yeah. And then there's this hilarious moment where God has to come all the way down to the ground to see this little tower. From God's perspective, they haven't got very far, but they're very pleased with themselves. And then God actually intervenes actively and muddles up their language, and then the project falls apart.
Yeah. It's actually one of the few stories of the Bible I'm familiar with, because that's supposed to be how different languages were born. It was through that story, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the functions that it serves as a sort of where the languages come from. Although, of course, you then get I don't think it's claiming that is the only way that languages can be formed. But interesting to think all the languages of the earth were one at that time, and it looked like they were building this big. It's almost like a globalist project if you think about it.
Yeah.
Right. What if humanity all cooperated and built this amazing thing, and then God comes and breaks up the cabal, breaks up the party? So yeah, I think we could see some allegories to the modern day where, what if we just made a one world government in some form? I don't think God's going to allow that to happen. And I suppose this is, maybe another reference to make then. The Garden of Eden, there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they are told, if you eat from this tree, you will be like God. And Adam and Eve see the fruit. They know perfectly well it's something they shouldn't be messing with, but they go ahead and do it anyway. And that, as we know, was the original sin, the thing that brought about all the suffering and pain that humanity's been living with ever since. So I think all of these are great examples. We've seen the Tower of Babel, we've seen the fruit being eaten, we've seen these people trying to live outside of the vine, like the reference that you just made. These are all stories in the Bible in which humanity attempts to go outside of God's plans and instructions and approaches, and then suffers. And I think it's the same thing with the story of Frankenstein. You've got this quite strong intuition that everybody has of like, don't do it, Frankenstein, it's unnatural. And he says, why not? I believe in my abilities. I believe in the goodness that I can produce on my own. I'm not going to heed all these warnings. And then in all of these stories, the consequences are dire.
Well, yeah. Well, one of the things I found interesting about this film was the mentor that Victor was working with regards to the reanimation. Well, not necessarily the reanimation project, but when he was just working underneath him, and he gets access to the diary, doesn't he? And which has all the all of the that gentleman's work. But earlier in the film, it's established that he's seen as a bit of a kook, a bit crazy. But they sort of say something that was quite interesting, was that he could go up to God and give him a lecture. And yet when you sort of see how he tries to rise himself up to the level where he can essentially bring about life like God, it actually completely destroys him.
If I can hop in on that, just because you prompted me on something that I thought was really interesting about the mentors at the university. Do you remember that an early scene, basically the first time we see Victor at the university? His tutor is doing a dissection, and Victor from up above in this circular theatre is looking down and argues with his tutor. Yeah? Do you remember that scene?
Yes.
It's like basically the first time he's in there and he's like, let me tell you, I actually know better than you, Professor. But it's that thing of, he's like, in his own mind, it's like he's God from on high speaking down to the mortal, telling the mortal, no, trust me, I know. I thought that's a good, maybe unintentional representation of Victor in his own mind is taking that place and saying, trust me, bro. But there's kind of a really interesting thing that was cut out of this film. And I think it's cut out of every film, but it's in the book, that is, I think, really important. And that is, we spend a large amount of the start of the novel with Victor's childhood and how he gets his hands on the scientific literature of the time that he can get his hands on. So he's buying copies of Paracelsus, Albertus Magnus, Cornelius Agrippa, and he turns up at uni thinking he's cock of the walk, and everyone tells him, bro, that science is stale, it's gone off, it's past the sell-by date, you left it out, you should have kept that science in the fridge, we've junked that stuff. And I thought that was really interesting as a kind of real world true example of how you can be rational but you should be humble, because Shelley presents us with 3 ages of scientific thinking that have all exploded each other and they've been junked out, and each one of them would have been thought the correct rational thing at the time. And now Frankenstein turns up in Geneva to be told that those things are like a couple of 100 years out of date. And even hearing that, he's like, nah, it'll be fine, and he goes ahead with it. And I thought that was a really interesting, quite subtle touch that Mary Shelley has in the novel.
There's also a level of irony there as well, in that, when he goes to Geneva, it's 1794, and they're talking about their science being, the definitive one, the correct one, and it's, you look at it with a 1994 lens, and most of their scientific theories, their medical practitioners, would have been completely, given the boot.
Yeah,
it is interesting hearing the trust the science stuff at the beginning of the film.
It does kind of give off that energy. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it does kind of give off that energy where it's like the science is the absolute knowledge and there's nothing higher than that. And then
it's curious considering that Dr. Frankenstein is at the beginning of the movie, trying to push back against the closed-mindedness of the establishment. And then he's kind of proven correct, because he does manage to do what everyone was telling him was impossible.
Yeah.
But then that turns out disastrously. So in a sense, the message of the film is the establishment will lie to you, but it's for your own good. He wanted to read it that way. It's kind of a slightly patronizing view, like, just keep quiet. If you think you've spotted a lie, it's probably for your own good. Do as we say, not as we do.
Yeah. Was it the scene where Victor was cutting open the man's head and getting into the brain? It's that bit where his friend passes out. One of those like comedic scenes. I think you were talking about Horrorshow, and you sort of talk about like mistakes, spotting mistakes. I can't remember if it was that scene or another one, but they're talking about. He starts going off again on a tangent about sort of like cheating death or beating death, and he makes a reference to say we know that we've seen that the fingernails and hair still grow after the person's deceased, and I was like, okay, either that's poor research on the producer's part, or that's just an easy spot for us to make, because obviously now we know that that's not actually the case. It's just the skin contracting on itself as the body dehydrates or dries up, but it gives off that appearance as though it's the nails and the hair grow.
This has been fact checked, debunked.
Yes.
But it's true. I think it's probably
it's treated as a science
example.
Yeah, but it's treated as a science in 1794 as like the absolute truth. But yeah, it's kind of like the refusal to accept any other theories, while also at the same time acknowledging from an outsider's perspective that science does consistently change with the facts, and it's demonstrated through the previous teachings that have been removed in favor of other tried and tested methods that will no doubt will be removed, or inevitably, as history went on to prove, that those things did get changed and replaced, and no doubt things that we're probably doing today will one day become obsolete.
Yeah, totally. Any study of science should tell you that things will not last long. Axioms in science will change, and that should, maybe you don't reject it, but you should have an astounding, overwhelming degree of caution. Not just for whether, say, something is safe, but the idea of, if you do a thing, maybe you do it amazingly, maybe you get a gold star for doing a new thing, but there are consequences that you may not have thought of. To be possibly very depressing on this horror stream, we'll go back to some more puerile gay reading jokes in a second. I promise you guys, I've got the guys rolling about in the ooze. We'll make a very obvious joke about that. But for all the work, say, on healthcare to expand lifetimes, we have new problems of the fact that we can't really extend the neurological health, and we've created a new problem. So it's you have an input in the system. Think of it as the sort of scientific equivalent of the knowledge problem in economics. You do not have complete data on the system. You cannot foresee what an intervention will do, and therefore you should be very humble. There was a good comment here, Erin. I think that's probably a fair reading. I think Shelley does have. I'll be honest, I haven't looked into her religious beliefs, but I think what we see in her is a sort of a caution. She's focused on the science world, but if this is a reaction to the full-on rationalism of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in particular, then I think we could see where she would get that caution, that desire for humility, and how can you say, respect for human life as it is, even if she were not Christian. But I'm afraid that's something I haven't looked into at the moment. I think you said that she was an atheist above, so it's quite interesting that she makes something so balanced in this.
Yeah, I feel like she isn't writing something that's simple and has a straightforward axe to grind. In some ways, that's maybe why it's an enduring work of art, because so often it's obvious if you have an agenda and you're just saying something straightforward. And there's maybe there's a certain traditionalist hint in the idea that the motivations of Frankenstein, I don't know how true this is in the book, at least in the film, he's kind of justifying the move forwards with these vague ideas of like, well, it could be good for humanity, against all the people who are saying, well, let's hold back. And then, obviously Frankenstein then ends up regretting it. So you could see from the time that she was writing that she might be seeing or sensing in the air that what is being called progress and science might be having some negative effects that people kind of aren't realizing. That's a thing we do. Now, I also wanted to bring up a potential reading. If we wanted to find an anti-religious angle to the story, what if we saw Dr. Frankenstein as God and we then are the monster? And then it's an exploration of, did God know what he was doing? Look at the awful existence that we've had. He did a bad job creating a second-rate version of himself, and we're all doomed to just rage against that decision and wish that we'd never been created. So what do you think about that reading?
I could push back on that a bit and say, or almost take it to like its extreme. Take it to its extreme and sort of agree with the premise, or agree with that base, the base in that Victor is God and we are the monster. And then you could sort of say, I don't know where I'm going with this, but essentially you could have Victor as, that flawed man, he was created in man's image because of all the bits put together. And he is very much a flawed being without guidance, almost like he strayed from his creator. And he almost bites back at his creator in terms of essentially being rejected by his God, for want of a better word.
I mean, it's an interesting framing. Luke, tell me if I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but I'm trying to see that, but I feel it almost actually leans straight back onto Christianity in a way. So so Frankenstein is God and creates the creation, and he isn't referred to as a monster in this. He's just credited as the creation, which is very deliberate. The novel makes constant use of creature, obviously coming from creation, fallen angel, Adam. So the novel is dripping in these references. And then the relationship sours, okay? It goes wrong. But both this version of the story and the various films take different angles on this. This one is closer to the novel in that you really get the sense that actually it's the absence of contact with the creator that has let the creature go rotten. So in this and the original, the creature is out in the woods, encounters a family, and he does his best, and it's very much a nurture rather than nature. So in the nature nurture debate, he's met with cruelty and then he becomes cruel. But in the story of Christianity, there was a connection reached out in Jesus. So I'd say that would be, again, I feel like I'm possibly stumbling into heresy every time I try it. But the idea that it could be seen as a cautionary tale. If you didn't have that reaching out, you would be able to stumble. If it's just sort of creation's adrift as the creature is here, then you could go wrong. You could go savage. You could go brutal. And the creature's not a pure monster. He is. He's learned. He's moved by poetry.
He chokes out
But-
children.
Yeah, he does that after he gets totally blackpilled on humanity, in a very similar way as happens in this film.
I'm sorry, yeah, I don't want to be that guy who says, you know.
Yeah,
But when he's nice, he's so nice. You know.
you don't know him like I do.
Stop, well, mate. You know, you might be you might be a nice chap most of the time, but it's it's the choking children to death bit that kind of like ruins it for you, lad. So sorry, you kind of lose brownie points for me there.
He does repeatedly say he wants that contact. He wants to know his creator, and it's that rejection which turns him wrong. So you could say, actually, in a way, it's even trying to view it in that way. I feel like it sort of draws a distinction that makes it quite easy to see in a way that validates Christianity, or is at least complementary to a Christian perspective. I felt I may have rambled that one. What do you reckon?
No, I think there's definitely sort of a lost soul sort of narrative in the monster's character arc for sure, definitely. I mean, again, even questioning whether the fact that he, whether he has a soul just because of the way he's created, like he's, bits of like, he's made up of humans, but is he human? Is he natural? That's the, obviously that's the question of the Frankenstein story. But yeah, I think it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Erin in chat makes an interesting comment that man created God would be the anti-religious reading, as in, if I've interpreted that idea correctly, it's that Frankenstein makes a monster in the film in the same way that humans make gods in real life. So religion is an invented thing, and it's and you kind of make a version of yourself, and then the creation that you've made, this kind of God. Say if you take the Christian example, anti-Christian rhetoric would point to things like the Crusades or the Christian, the Nazis were Christians, all these kinds of things. So what if, well, obviously Shelley wouldn't have been referring to the Nazis, but the point is, if you take that reading, then the creature that's created that then goes on a rampage and causes all this destruction so that flips it again. Although that would be very confusing if that was the allegory, to call it the creature and flip it upside down, where the creature represents the creator. But I think I could just get my head around that reading.
Yeah, that's kind of how I interpreted that comment. Okay. I personally don't. I would probably lean more on the fact that that Victor would be the creator side, and the monster would be the sort of like man corrupted, basically. That's how I would picture it.
Yeah, I mean, he is very much creating what you might call an Übermensch of the time. Like it's explicit that the creature is bigger, faster, stronger than him. And nevertheless, those rational bits of superiority don't count and sort of work against him.
And another reference then might be useful, a biblical maybe aside, is that there's this really fascinating bit in Genesis which refers to the Nephilim, and these were they're called like the great men of old, men of renown. They're kind of portrayed like giants, like these figures of superhuman strength, and they are the product of what's called the sons. What is it? It's basically the idea of like angels breeding with human women. Just say, I mean, this is all pre-flood, so I think the idea is that there were these kind of
Robbie Williams has entered the chat.
Half humans around who then get wiped out by the flood. So yeah, maybe there's a shadow of the same concept there, that there's something, and I think that this is meant to be an unnatural, this is a product of something that should not have happened, but they are stronger and bigger and terrifying, and there's not many verses in the Bible. You're reading the tea leaves a bit to figure out what it's talking about, but in the concept of this creature who is a tortured but uber strong being who has this short half-life, that's quite an interesting parallel.
There's also one last thing I thought I absolutely have to get in here, is the idea that I've touched on in a very old video, but about how our scope for horror gets a bit reductive. It gets reduced over time and contracted, because in watching something like this, in reading something like Frankenstein in the original, you become aware of a source of horror that isn't necessarily even there anymore, and that is the idea of horror from blasphemy, a sort of spiritual horror, a sort of deep violation of what you know to be good, which I think is a kind of thing that's a hard sell nowadays. Now, Stephen King writes in Dan's Macabre about his categories of horror. He gives you 3 levels, which is a sort of a deep uneasiness, a middle one that I forget, and then just straight up revulsion, where he talks about tentacles bursting eyeballs, and he says, it's a cheap shot. Sometimes I have to do it, but he wants to hit you at a deeper level first. And it made me think that in the original story, there's so much that I think would be naturally horrifying that we lose in translation here. Like this idea of grave digging, of defiling, of blaspheming would be on its own a source of horror. So you don't need to see the children's bodies piling up or the hangings, although they do happen here and they do happen in the story. But it's like this idea that there's a source of horror that we're no longer able to see. I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's something perhaps we've become desensitized to, although maybe you could argue that pushed to enough of an extreme, people still feel a particular violation when they see the very overtly sexual drag acts in front of toddlers, and that people don't have a problem with the highly sexualized drag acts existing, but they feel it is wrong to have it in juxtaposition with the innocence of childhood. So you have to push it pretty hard these days before people feel the revulsion, and you have to imagine that those children, when they are adults, will not have any problem with seeing that happen to their children, and maybe there is another step that could push it even further. There's the story where the angels visit Sodom, and the men of the city want to have sex with these angels, these sort of supernatural visitors, which, I mean, obviously that story has ended up being shorthand in the English language, right? Sodomy is a word for gay sex, but actually there's hints that one of the things that the place is being condemned for is actually like one of the things that they're being condemned for is that they didn't recognize that it was non-human men, like that these were angels. And it's kind of this theme then that the reason that Sodom was destroyed was that it had been on this progression where, first of all, they failed to they failed to look after the poor, and they had, no regard for justice. That was their first error, and their sins sort of pile up, and then it's right at the end that they've lost all senses of the profane, and the borders are all falling down, and there's this sexual excess. So from that angle, the fact that we no longer have that category of horror about some of the things in this story maybe should be worrying.
I mean, when you say that, it brings to mind a point about the book just about present here, which is Victor does this transgression and he justifies it. He's got a good reason for it. And I do want to talk about, White Hart's comment here is good. What the really interesting thing is, like, the monster really doesn't go for Victor, but the damage starts leaking out to everyone around him. It's like he doesn't pay the direct price, but it starts to just affect those around him. Eventually, it just it leaks into the community. It takes a long time before he actually feels a direct effect himself, which I think is how a lot of this horrific violations of what I can only want. Sanctity is the word that comes to mind. You can't, and I use this sort of thought process when I talk about the sort of censorship. It's like, I can't tell you that if you allow this scene in a movie to be 25 seconds long of violence versus make it 7 seconds long, that we will have precisely 17 more violent incidents in schools. I can't give you the equation. I think any attempt to do that would be silly, but you get a more diffuse effect going out that you can't directly attribute. It sort of spreads out. And you're talking about Sodom made me think about that. But White Hart's comment here, really important. There are things people wouldn't think of as part of the horror is, the grave digging, the stitching bodies to another might be a sort of just a gross factor rather than an unnatural factor. The idea that it is a man creating life without a man and a woman outside of matrimony, that sort of unnatural thing is in the horror that Mary Shelley's audience would have read instantly as, oh, that's deeply wrong. That's deeply wrong. She doesn't need anyone to be, have their nose clawed in with a hammer. She can get the feeling of psychological discomfort and unease from those violations of sanctity. And it's a subtle horror that I think we miss. It's an allegory of alcoholism. Not sure about that, but we are covering Pet Sematary very soon. I'm attempting a live commentary on that, and we will most definitely talk about alcohol abuse in that. Yes.
So, I've just done a small bit of research into Mary Shelley's religious background. Her parents, her dad was definitely, he was a philosopher and an atheist, as was her husband, was quite an outspoken romantic poet, Percy Shelley. So she had, I guess, a lot of connection with people who were atheistic. And I think the suggestion is that her views were a little bit different, maybe more nuanced. So perhaps she was exploring the topic in a way that would not be directly cutting against her husband's published opinions. She was half agreeing with him and half arguing against him, coming out with this quite interesting and and complex take where it's not straightforward to interpret. Any of the allegories that we've put forwards sort of sound like they could be correct, but it's not clear which direction the story is taking you. I guess the obvious thing is, what would it mean if we could create life? What does that imply? I think that's an enduring question. Like, we all have this thing of consciousness. Where does it come from? It's such a deep mystery. Yeah.
And I think, as this would say, these kind of mysteries, if we think we've solved them, we've probably not. But that does bring us to our hour. I'm hesitant to give a score on this one, as we've not talked in depth about the film. So I will give a very cursory score for me, using our 12 burger scale. And it's got to be, I would say it. If you want to go back and fully enjoy it, we could talk in more depth. But for me, this is a cozy camp, rather dated but not terrible. 6 burgers, probably in a Happy Meal. It's got that 90s feel to it. It's a Happy Meal. 6 Happy Meal burgers with more cheese than you expected upon opening. How about yourself, Luke? And I don't know if we'll get TCG because he's off to. He's got to start his stream, and we'll.
No, I'm still in.
All right.
I'll give you a score. I can't leave without giving you some burgers.
Shall I go first? I'll go quickly. I think I enjoyed it. I'm going to give it a 7. I think it passes by very pleasantly. It leaves you with some interesting philosophical thoughts, which is always, I feel, important, so that you don't feel like you've wasted time watching the film. You've had to think, but you've also had a good time. So I think it's a 7.
I can respect
I'd agree.
that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd probably say a 7 as well. Some of the things that sort of irked me a little bit with some of the quality of the acting. It was a bit sus at parts. Yeah. It was a bit lacking in especially in the early stages. It felt like a film that sort of warmed up into where the characters were sort of warming up into their roles. It felt a bit shaky to begin with, and then by the end it seemed all right. Some of the sets looked a bit obvious or bare, but apparently that's kind of the style of the chap who worked on the film. So I'll obviously take that into consideration if I come into any sort of like any of his future works. But yeah, I mean, in terms of things like some of the gore, man, I mean, suit you, sir. When it came to punching a hole through Helena Bonham Carter's chest to pull out her still beating heart, suit you, sir. Beautiful. Love that. And I have to say, the makeup. The makeup artist who worked on the design for the Frankenstein and for Frankenstein's monster and Helena Bonham Carter when she became a monster herself, I thought was spectacular. So you a lot of the burgers are in respect to the work that went there.
I can see that. I've been harsh. I might have been harsh. I don't know. It's gorgeous. I was very distracted by Kenneth and some of the sillier elements, but
it's a kind of Liberace take on a classic.
It really is. I mean, it came out so on the Rotten Tomatoes, the scores are in the 40s. 49% audience, 42% critic. You compare it to Victor Frankenstein, which I would love to talk about, but Luke, I like you too much to assign this film to you. That's a James McAvoy one, and Kenneth Branagh really reminded me of McAvoy in this. That is 26 for critics, 35 for audience. Can't believe I agree with the critics for once. But The Curse of Frankenstein, 1957. That's a contrast. 81% critics, 77% audience. So if in doubt, go for an older Frankenstein. I think we can say. But yeah, I think that should be all the scores. Quite mixed selection, but generally people are in the middle. I can see some people liking it more. It is of its time. There is a lot to enjoy, and it is.
I enjoy
not
the
offensive.
fact that every time they try to remake it, or you might say reanimate the film, it gets slightly worse.
Oh, there is something in that for definite. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, I would say check it out, but watch a couple of them. Watch a couple, and then you can contrast. It's not a loyal adaptation, but it is not a waste of your time. But all right, but we have run over our hour, and TCG has a community quiz to go. So TCG, if you've got a link for the community quiz, I will get that in the chat. People head over there. And as we're closing up, a massive thanks to everyone who've watched. Huge thanks to you, Luke, coming back on.
Pleasure. Yeah, I always enjoy listening to you, and even more when I can come on and chat movies with you.
Always good, and really, really good to have your perspective on this one. Thanks also. Oh, and folks, we shilled at the start, but definitely watch Lambda's Stream Festival, I want to call it, next week.
Yeah, I'm calling it Lambda Conversations, and
Lambda
it's
Conversations.
in UK time. I'm basically streaming from like 5 o'clock till midnight every day of next week. Loads of really amazing guests. So yeah, keep an eye. I'll probably post on Twitter tomorrow who all the guests are.
Yeah, excellent. All right, I wanted to shill it again because that was excellent. But we won't keep you from the quiz any longer. Massive thanks to my guests. Massive thanks to you. I will announce the horror homework next tomorrow. So I won't keep you around any longer. Horror homework. I'll say it now. John, it's the thing you suggested. Bloody Pit of Horror 1965. Found on YouTube in its entirety. I haven't watched it myself, but we will get to it. So Bloody Pit of Horror 1965. I'm taking a complete gamble on that one, John, but you liked it, so I'm going to give it a chance. All right, that's all from me. Massive thanks to you all, and go over to the community quiz. Thanks, y'all. Cheers.